My name is Dr. Peter Reynolds, and I'm professor of Bible and Theology here at Nelson University. I teach various Bible classes. I teach the Greek class here, and today I'm going to be talking about the story of the woman at the well. I really want to talk about reading a story within the context of the whole Bible can help us to better understand some of the nuances that we might miss if we don't recognize those echoes. Oftentimes, stories in the Bible, you may notice this especially reading through the book of Genesis, you might find that there are kind of patterns that tend to repeat over and over again as you're reading through the stories. Stories feel familiar when similar kinds of things are happening to the same kind of characters. And this is, a reflection of what is happening, but also those kind of echoes help us to think about those stories together. We think about how one story helps us to interpret and understand another one. Well, one of the patterns that happens a number of times in the Bible is a scene which Robert Alter has called betrothal type scene. And I think this is really interesting. In a betrothal type scene, you see a kind of recurring pattern. An important figure in the story, male figure, a man comes up to a well, and there at the well, he will meet a person, a young woman, to whom he will become engaged. They will go off, she will go off to her family, go talk to her father, and the two will then become betrothed. And this is a scene that we see a number of times in the Bible. The first one of these we see is the story of Isaac. Now, if you read the story of Isaac is a guy to whom stuff happens. He's rarely the active person in a story. Things are happening to him. So it's pretty appropriate that Isaac himself is not there, but Eliezer is sent on his behalf. When he comes to find a wife for him, the question is how will we find who the right one is? And it's whoever comes out and gives water, both to me and to the animals. So comes out, brings water, she goes back and talks then to her brother, arrangements are made, and a marriage follows. And we see the same kind of story in the story of Jacob. Jacob, is running away from his brother who wants to kill him, for some good reasons. And he goes back to the place where his uncle is, and there he meets Leah, the beautiful Leah. She's there at the well, and she's waiting because the story says there's a big stone over the spring so that no one shepherd gets all the water. Some sense of it needs a few people to move this rock to kind of make it fair. Jacob, in a real demonstration of how manly he is, goes and moves the stone for her. Leah's swoony, and she goes back, talks to dad, they make arrangements. Now, if you know that story well, you know that he doesn't actually get to marry Rachel first. He marries Leah. There's a whole story there. But you see that pattern that happens. It's repeated. One kind of fun twist on that story is found in the story of Saul. Now, in the story of Saul, we find Saul. He's the hero of our story. This is who will become King Saul. And it says that he's off looking for his donkeys. Where have the donkeys gone? His dad sends him out on this errand. And it says he comes up to a well, and all the young women of the town are there. Now, this creates anticipation for the audience, because we know how this story goes. We've seen it a few times before. What's going to happen? Probably a bride for Saul is going to happen. But instead, he gets there, and it's a kind of hey, anybody seen my donkeys kind of situation. Now, probably one of the points of telling this story about Saul is that it's supposed to be kind of poking fun at him. But that you only get that reference if you know that this is a pattern that happens over and over again in the Bible. Now, in the Gospel of John, generally, whenever we're reading the stories of Gospel of John, oftentimes there are these wonderful layers upon layers of meanings. So when I talk about the story of the woman at the well here, this is not to replace some of the interpretations or the way you've heard this taught before, but maybe to kind of add to and enrich it. Because this story has a lot of the same elements. Jesus has gone into a foreign land. That's kind of a typical element of these stories. And he has he meets a woman, right? She's there at the well. And in fact, while they're at the well, they discuss marriage. Are you married? And she says no, and he says, actually, you've been married 5 times before. And there's this whole sense, right, of, there's this discussion about marriage. There's also a discussion about the difference between Samaria, the Jews and the Samaritans in terms of how they worship and what has kept them apart. Jesus is going to say, You guys worship in Mount Gerizim. We worship in Zion. You worship what you don't know. We worship what we do not know. But day is coming, and now has come, when the true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. So the thing that has kept them apart is going to be fixed, because Jesus now is sort of taking the place of, this is where God's presence is, in the person of Jesus. Now, here's where I think that this betrothal type scene comes up. Is this a story about how Jesus is going to marry a Samaritan woman? Is this a shocking story where really this is about Jesus' secret wife? No, it isn't any of that. But this concept of marriage is one which comes up a lot in the prophets in describing like the faithfulness of nations to Israel. It really famously in Hosea, where Israel is presented as an unfaithful wife. And in this story, and being presented this way, because the Samaritan woman will then leave Jesus, she goes into her town and she tells everybody about him. So there's a sense, it's like, oh, look, this is happening. But instead of leading to a marriage, all of these Samaritan people are coming, and they're coming to know Jesus because of her. Now, again, as I've said, in the prophets, this idea of marriage is often a sense of God's commitment to his people and their commitment to him. The discussion about marriage makes us maybe think of the stories about ancient Israel's unfaithfulness, right? And now God is bringing together in Jesus Samaria. Now, the city of Samaria is the leftover of the northern kingdom of Israel. And of course, Jerusalem is the center of the southern kingdom of Judah. These kingdoms have been separated for a long time. And when the prophets talked about God's restoration in the future, like in Jeremiah, when he talks about the new covenant, it's a new covenant that he will make with Israel and with Judah. Now, Jeremiah is writing at a time when basically the northern kingdom has been annihilated, but there's still that hope for reconciliation. So I think part of what's happening by Jesus' decisions, by the author, by John's decision to tell this story, is to make it clear that God is in fact fulfilling that prophecy, right? Beginning to reunite his people, now centered in Jesus. And so it is a kind of reunification. It is a kind of betrothal scene that is happening. And I think that's a real wonderful richness that you can get by seeing this sort of layers that come by thinking about the repetition of this biblical pattern. I also think there's another interesting sort of echo of an Old Testament story that happens here as well, about another story of a woman who's at a well. Now, the Samaritan woman we'll find is a woman who has been married multiple times, and she is not married to the man that she is with now. And oftentimes, when we've talked about this passage, we've said, wow, what a terrible person she is. Well, most of the time, most divorces in this time were probably initiated by men. She may have been divorced from all these men. She may also have, they may have died. We don't know what all the situation is. Perhaps she was barren, and so previous husbands had dispatched with her. But in any case, we do find her in the situation as someone who has been not honored, maybe someone who's been put aside. In the story of Abraham and Sarah, Sarah's enslaved woman, one of the solutions that they try to seek for their barrenness is that Sarah will try to give Abraham an enslaved woman who belongs to her. Her name is Hagar. Hagar will have a child with Abraham. This child will be Ishmael. Now, a couple of times, once just before the child is born, once after the child is born, and after Isaac is born as well, Sarah will want to get rid of Hagar and push her out. In one of these instances, we find Hagar has been sent out in the wilderness basically to die. She is there, she is hopeless, she is facing, her certain death. Well, we're told that God meets her there. God meets her there and leads her to a source of water, to a well. Hagar, in that moment, God says that he will also make a nation for Ishmael, and he encourages her, and she is restored back home. In this story, she names God. She says, I have seen the God who sees me. It's really a really powerful and touching story, and one of my favorite ones from the book of Genesis. Well, in the story of the Samaritan woman, who again is a little bit like Hagar in some ways, she has met God at the well in the person of Jesus. When she goes back into the city to tell the Samaritans about him, she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did." Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that's not the most inviting invitation. Hey, this guy told me all my dirty laundry. Maybe he'll do it for you too. But if we think about this story as a kind of an echo of that story that we read about with Hagar, then we can see, in some way, this is like the woman at the well saying, "Come and see the one who saw me." Jesus saw her for the situation that she was in. He loved her and he invited her in, and she has come and invited them as well. So I hope you can see some of the benefits that having a real sense of these kind of patterns that we see in biblical narrative can help us to see that, Jesus through his own actions, God through his providence, and the authors of Scripture through kind of decisions that they make about which stories to tell, can help us to draw our attention to some of these stories, to help us to understand them better, to help us to see a greater depth of meaning in them. Thank you.